This is the instructor video for Chapter 4, where we're going to look at tissues. So we're going to start with an introduction to tissues. So if you remember from previous chapters, histology is another branch of microscopic anatomy, and it involves the study of tissues. So can you remember what the definition of a tissue was? Remember that it is a group of cells that work together to perform one or more functions. So we've already looked at cells in Chapter 3, and the body has approximately 200 different types of cells, and so when multiple cell types are working together to perform different functions, that is what we call a tissue. There are only 4 basic tissue types that those 200 cells make up: epithelial tissue, connective tissue, muscle tissue, and neural tissue. So this is a brief overview. So again, remember, we already talked about cells in Chapter 3, and cells secrete extracellular materials and fluids, and this is, remember, extracellular means on the outside of the cell, so this is fluid and fibers that exist outside the cell. And if we take the cells plus the extracellular materials and fluids and combine them together, we get tissues, which then have special functions. And as we're going to see in this chapter, the 4 types of tissue: epithelial tissue, which covers our surfaces, lines internal passageways, and produces glandular secretions. We have connective tissue, which fills our internal spaces, provides structural support, and stores energy. We have muscle tissue, which is all about movement. And we have nervous tissue, which is all about carrying information through electrical impulses. And then in upcoming chapters, we're going to start going through different organ systems. So just a reminder that tissues combine to make organs, and then organs combine and work together to make organ systems. Now we're going to talk specifically about epithelial tissue, and in this section we're going to cover an overview, characteristics of epithelial tissue, and their functions. And this is an image of pseudostratified columnar epithelium. So epithelial tissue is the tissue that covers all of the exposed surfaces of your body. Now, these are surfaces that are exposed to the outside, like your skin, and these are also surfaces that are exposed to inner compartments. So for example, the surface of your stomach or the inner surface of your blood vessels. So we call those internal linings. So basically, if there is a surface anywhere outside or inside the body, epithelial tissue is going to be covering it. Epithelial tissue includes both epithelia, which is the actual cells that are lining these surfaces, and glands. So some important characteristics to know about epithelial tissue. We say the epithelial tissue has a characteristic of cellularity, meaning that it is made of 1 or more layers of cells that are bound very tightly together. And we are going to look at the specific mechanisms by which they are bound one to another in another section. They also have the characteristic of polarity, and polarity means that you have structural and functional differences within the same cell, and we're going to look at that in more detail on the next slide. They also have the characteristic of attachment. So epithelia are attached to an underlying basement membrane, and this allows the epithelial tissue to have a border and also to resist stretching. Epithelial tissue is also avascular. That means it does not have blood vessels. So the cells that make up the epithelial tissue must get their nutrients and oxygen from the connective tissue underneath. So wherever you find epithelial tissue, you're going to find connective tissue underneath it. And connective tissue is our next type of tissue in the next section. Epithelial tissue also has the characteristic of regeneration. So the cells that actually form the exposed surfaces frequently get damaged and die and fall off, and so they have to be continuously replaced by stem cell divisions. Again, think of your skin, right? The outermost surface of your skin is constantly getting bombarded and damaged, and it sloughs off and you have to replace it. The same thing with, for example, the lining of your digestive tract. So let's talk more about polarity. So when we talk about polarity, we're talking about distinct and different surfaces depending on what side of the cell you're looking at. So epithelial cells have what's called an apical surface, and then they've got 3 basolateral surfaces. So the apical surface is the side that is exposed to either the internal or external environment. So your skin, the apical surface would be the side that you can touch, and linings for, like, say, your digestive tract, the apical surface would be the side that is facing, like, the inside of the stomach or the inside of the intestines. So in this picture here, the apical surface is up here at the top of the cells. So the apical surface is where you can find some specializations, like you can find microvilli, which is shown on the cell to the left, and areas where you need an increased surface area. So we covered microvilli in chapter 3, and we learned that they increase the surface area, so they provide more surface area membrane for absorption of, like, nutrients, for example. So we consider cells that have microvilli as being transport specialists. And you would find epithelial tissue with microvilli in places like the digestive tract, where you need to absorb nutrients, and the urinary tract, where you need to change the concentration of the urine before it's expelled. Cilia was also discussed in chapter 3. So some epithelial cells will have cilia on their apical surface. These are cells that are going to be responsible for moving substances around. So for example, in the respiratory tract, you will find epithelial cells with cilia that help to move mucus. And in the reproductive tracts, you will find cilia in males to help move sperm, and in females to help move the egg. So the other 3 surfaces are the basolateral surfaces. So the 2 sides would be the lateral surfaces, and then the bottom would be the basal surface. At the basal surface, so the very bottom, you have a basement membrane. And again, remember, epithelial cells are always attached, or at least their bottommost layer is always attached to a basement membrane. The basement membrane has 2 parts. The top part is called the basal lamina, and it is secreted by the epithelial cells that sit above the membrane. The bottom layer is called the reticular lamina, and it is secreted by the connective tissues that are underneath the basement membrane. So remember, epithelial cells are always sitting on top of connective tissue, and the basement membrane divides the 2. So half of the basement membrane is made by the epithelial cells, and half of the basement membrane is made by the underlying connective tissue cells. Now we will cover the functions of epithelial tissue. The first function is to provide physical protection. That's what linings do. They provide protection, and it protects from abrasion, dehydration, and destructive chemical or biological agents. For example, your epithelial linings help keep bacteria from getting inside your body. They also control permeability in much the same way that the plasma membrane controls permeability for the cell. Your epithelial tissue can also control what crosses it. For example, the lining of your digestive tract can control what nutrients or chemicals that you absorb and which ones you don't. Epithelial tissue also provides sensation. Most epithelial tissue has a large nerve supply to it. So think of your skin. In this instance, you have lots of nerve endings in your skin. There is also a specialized type of epithelial tissue called neuroepithelium, which is specialized for specific sensory function. And you'll talk about the different sensory areas of the body in Biology 2252. And finally, epithelial tissue can produce specialized secretions, and that is the job of the part of the tissue that is called glands. And there are 2 types of glands. There are exocrine glands and endocrine glands, and we'll talk more detail about those in a bit. In this section, we are going to cover the intercellular connections that hold epithelial cells together, and we'll also talk about maintenance and repair of epithelial tissue. And this picture on this slide is an example of stratified squamous epithelium. So intercellular connections are also called cell junctions, and they hold one cell tightly to another cell. And again, this goes back to the idea of epithelial tissues having the characteristic of cellularity. So the first type of connection we'll look at is called a tight junction, and it's shown here in this image at the apical surface of the cell. You can see the tight junctions here, here, and here, and you can also see a close-up view here. So they typically do encircle the apical region of an epithelial cell. So remember, you've got the apical side and then the three basolateral sides. The tight junctions are typically always going to be closer to the apical region. They're composed of proteins that actually interlock with each other, so very tight interlocking proteins. Just inferior to the tight junction, you can find an adhesion belt. And an adhesion belt is an area where the cell membrane and neighboring cells are attached to the what's called the terminal web, which is that network of microfilaments that exist close to the apical surface of a cell. So again, we can see the adhesion belt, we can see the terminal web here in this image, and you can see that it's made up of small microfilaments. Tight junctions are tight enough to prevent the passage of water and solutes between cells. So this is very important in a lot of linings in the body. Let's look at an example in the intestines, right? So the intestines, you might have bacteria in there. You might have different things that you eat, like dietary antigens that aren't broken down yet and not ready to be absorbed. And so in a normal intestinal lining, these tight junctions are going to hold the cells together so tightly that none of this is going to be able to pass to get inside of your cells. If you were to have impaired tight junctions, then these substances that should be kept in the lumen of the intestines can now invade the interior of the body. The second type of intercellular connection is a gap junction, and that is shown here in the image. It kind of looks like a bunch of little holes, and this is a closer view here. So gap junctions contain these membrane channels that are made from a protein called a connexon. And so all of these connexons come together in a circle and actually form a pore that connects one cell to another. So because it's a pore, like a channel, ions and small molecules can pass from one cell to another through these connexon pores. So intercellular connection-wise, a gap junction can allow cells to directly communicate to each other. And we're going to see how this is important, for example, in cardiac muscle tissue and the way that the heart works when you get into Biology 2252. And the third type of intercellular connection is a desmosome. Desmosomes are shown in this image as the solid-looking purple circles. And desmosomes are linkages between molecules in the cell membrane that are called cell adhesion molecules, or CAMs. So CAM does stand for cell adhesion molecule. The cell adhesion molecules also link up with proteoglycans. So if you remember, proteoglycans were proteins with carbohydrates attached to them. The desmosome also provides a connection to the cytoskeleton. In this image, you can see the desmosome in the smaller picture at the bottom right, and you can see how it helps connect this portion of the plasma membrane to intermediate filaments on the inside of the cell. Desmosomes are very strong. They can resist stretching and twisting. And in fact, cells that are held together by desmosomes usually can't even be pulled or separated from each other. You can find desmosomes in your skin cells, and because your skin cells have these really tight connections, this is why your skin tends to peel off in sheets rather than coming off one cell at a time. So imagine, like after a sunburn, you can actually get like a whole sheet of cells that peels off of the outer layer of the skin. And that's because of desmosomes. So there are two types of desmosomes. Spot desmosomes allow cell-to-cell connections, so they would be found on the lateral sides, and they are connecting one cell to a neighboring cell. Whereas a hemidesmosome is going to be found on the basal surface, and it connects the cell to the basement membrane. So there's this close-up picture here. We already talked about the basement membrane in a previous slide, but this molecule shown at the top of the picture, that is the hemidesmosome that is connecting that cell to the basement membrane. So a little bit about maintenance and repair. So epithelial cells have a hard life. Because they are linings, they are subjected to a lot of different stresses, physical stresses, chemical stresses, lots of attacks, abrasions, etc. So to give you an example, some of your intestinal epithelial cells only live for 1 or 2 days. Not only are they exposed to all of the food particles rubbing up against them, but they've got acids and everything else that's going on in your digestive tract. Your skin cells as well don't usually last very long. So because epithelial cells are constantly being damaged and lost, we have to replace them. So there are epithelial stem cells that continually divide to replace the other lost epithelial cells. The stem cells are usually located near the basement membrane. So if we have a multi-layered epithelial lining, and in just a few minutes we're going to talk about classification of different types of epithelial tissue, but if you've got a layer made up of multiple different layers, then the stem cells are going to be at the very bottom, closest to the basement membrane. And the epidermis is the epithelial lining of your skin. And so your skin definitely has stem cells to replace the cells that are being lost. And then you can also find stem cells even if you have a single layer of epithelial tissue. This is simple cuboidal epithelial tissue in this picture, but again, in between the regular epithelial cells, we have sandwiched little stem cells that can help replace damaged and lost epithelial cells. In this section, we're going to talk about the classification and the different types of epithelial tissue, and in this image, we are looking at transitional epithelium. So epithelia can be classified in several ways, but the two primary things you are looking at is cell shape and the number of layers. So we have 3 cell shapes, squamous, cuboidal, and columnar, and we have 2 types of layers. So a simple layer is a single layer of cells atop the basement membrane. Stratified is multiple layers of cells atop the basement membrane. The 3 shapes, so squamous is like a flat cell, so think of like a pancake or a fried egg. Cuboidal is a square shape like a cube, and columnar is a tall, skinny shape like a column. And then when we're looking at stratified tissues and trying to decide whether they are squamous, cuboidal, or columnar, remember to always look at the side that is facing the lumen, which would be the side that's the furthest away from the basement membrane. So the lumen would be what it's lining, right? And so when you're looking at the shapes here, if you're looking at stratified squamous, you're looking at the shape of the cells up against the lumen, not the shape of the cells next to the basement membrane. Same thing over here with the stratified columnar. We would be looking at the shape that is next to the lumen and not the shape that is next to the basement membrane. All right, so squamous epithelia, the cells are thin and flat. And the first type of this type of epithelia is simple squamous. So again, remember, simple means 1 layer. So we are talking about a single layer of flat, thin cells atop the basement membrane, and then in all cases, epithelia tissue is going to have connective tissue underneath it. So you do need to know the location and functions of all of these tissue types. So you can find simple squamous epithelium in the mesothelia, which lines your body cavities, which we talked about in chapter 1, the endothelia, which lines your heart and blood vessels, portions of the kidney tubules, the inner lining of the cornea, which is part of your eye, and the alveoli of the lungs. Simple squamous epithelium functions to reduce friction, so think about those body cavities. Controls vessel permeability, so in your capillaries it controls what can cross from your blood into your body. And it performs absorption and secretion. So like in the alveoli of the lungs, this is where oxygen is absorbed. Also keep in mind that the term endothelium is when we are talking about the lining of the heart and the blood vessels. And mesothelium is the term when we're talking about the lining of the body cavities. We've already been introduced to mesothelium in chapter 1. So the mesothelium is actually that pericardium and pleura and peritoneum. And so the mesothelium itself is the epithelial lining of those serous membranes. So again, we learned about the linings of the body cavities in chapter 1. You may need to review that information. The next type of squamous epithelia is stratified squamous. This is going to be found where mechanical stresses are severe. For example, the locations, the surface of your skin, the lining of your mouth, throat, esophagus, the lining of the rectum, anus, and vagina. So anywhere there is a potential to have a lot of abrasion, a lot of objects or sharp objects or any type of object rubbing against something, you're going to find stratified squamous epithelium. Again, when we're identifying this, we are looking at the shape of the cells, at the apical portion of the tissue, or the part that is up against the lumen. This is where you would find the flattened squamous cells. If you look down close to the basement membrane, they're all going to look cuboidal. So you need to make sure that you're looking up at the very apical most portion and not down next to the basement membrane. And again, epithelial tissues sit on top of connective tissue. The functions of stratified squamous, since you find them in areas where mechanical stresses are severe, it shouldn't be surprising that they function to provide physical protection against abrasion, pathogens, and chemical attack. There are two types of stratified squamous epithelia. There is keratinized squamous, and in this particular type of tissue, there are a lot of those intermediate filaments made up of keratin protein. And this is, for example, found in your skin. So you have keratinized stratified squamous epithelium in areas where you need the lining to be very tough and water resistant. Then you have non-keratinized areas, so these do not have as much of the intermediate filaments containing keratin. And this would be like your mouth, throat, rectum, anus, and vagina. And these areas have to be kept moist. If they're not, they will dry out and degrade, and so you have glands embedded in the non-keratinized tissue that help to produce mucus to keep these areas moist. All right, so cuboidal epithelia, the cells resemble little boxes or little squares. Simple cuboidal, again, if it's simple, it just means one layer sitting on top of the basement membrane. There's the connective tissue underneath. You can find simple cuboidal epithelium in glands, ducts, portions of the kidney tubules, and in your thyroid gland. And they function as limited protection, secretion, and absorption. And so when you're looking at these in slides in the lab, you have to kind of notice that the basement membrane is here so that you can recognize that this is one layer of cells up against the lumen, which is the white area here. Stratified cuboidal would be multiple layers of cuboidal cells. This is actually relatively rare, so you don't have to identify this tissue in lab. So you can find this types of tissue in the lining of some ducts, but again, it's pretty rare. And it functions to protect, secrete, and absorb. And the ducts that do have it are some of your sweat glands and the larger ducts of the mammary glands. Transitional epithelia is a special type of epithelia that sometimes looks cuboidal and sometimes looks squamous. So with this type of epithelia, if it's relaxed, and your bladder is a good example, so your bladder's relaxed because it doesn't have any urine in it. If we were to look at the tissue when it's in the relaxed state, it's going to look like it's cuboidal. So it actually looks a bit stratified cuboidal. But when the tissue is stretched, like when your bladder is full of urine, then it looks squamous. So the topmost layer up against the lumen is actually going to be flat, thin cells. So you can find transitional epithelium in your urinary system. You can find it in the bladder, the renal pelvis, which is a part of the kidney, and ureters. It functions to allow expansion and recoil after stretching. So again, think of how your bladder can stretch out when it's full of urine, but then it can recoil back to its normal shape. A little hint for when you're in lab. In lab, you do have to identify transitional epithelia. And in lab, keep in mind the tissue samples that you look at on slides are always relaxed. So they're always going to look like the stratified cuboidal kind of appearance. And stratified cuboidal is not on your ID sheet because it's very rare. So when you're in lab, if your first instinct is to say something is stratified cuboidal, it's probably transitional epithelium. Columnar epithelia looks like little columns with tall, slender cells. If you look at simple columnar, this again is a single layer of cells that are tall and thin. And you can again see the basement membrane in this image with the connective tissue underneath. You can find simple columnar epithelium lining your stomach, intestine, gallbladder, uterine tubes, and the collecting duct of the kidneys. This type of tissue functions to protect, secrete, and absorb. You can also typically find microvilli on simple columnar cells. So these are your transport specialists. For example, you'll notice that we already mentioned the cells that line your intestines. So the microvilli in the histology slide images look like a thin little fuzz on the outer surface of the cells. And in this image at the top right, you can see little goblet cells. These are a type of exocrine gland that secretes mucus. And we're going to talk about epithelial glandular tissue in the next section. Now here's a special type of tissue called pseudo-stratified columnar. If you remember your root words, pseudo means false. And so the reason that it's called pseudo-stratified columnar is because it looks like it's stratified, but it really isn't. Every cell actually touches the basement membrane, meaning that it is a simple layer of single cells, but it appears to be stratified. So we call the pseudo-stratified columnar epithelia. You can find this lining the nasal cavity, the trachea, and bronchi, as well as portions of the male reproductive tract. It functions to protect, secrete, and to move mucus with the cilia. So this type of tissue does typically possess cilia, which in your histology slides looks like a much more distinguishable fringe on the cells facing the lumen. And so think about this tissue being located in areas where you need to move stuff, like the mucus that moves through your respiratory tract and the sperm that moves through the male reproductive tract. And then there is a true stratified columnar, but this one is actually also pretty rare, like the stratified cuboidal. So again, if you see something that looks like it is stratified columnar, it's probably going to be pseudo-stratified columnar. So a true stratified columnar would have column-like cells at the apical surface. The cells underneath are going to look more cuboidal. So you'll never look at the cell shape next to the basement membrane. And then again, we have connective tissue underneath. You can find stratified columnar in small areas in the pharynx, epiglottis, anus, mammary glands, salivary gland ducts, and the urethra, and it functions for protection. And in our last section for epithelial tissue, we're going to be talking about glandular epithelia and then an overall summary. And this is an image of simple cuboidal epithelium. So glandular epithelia are epithelial cells that are specialized to produce secretions. So we already mentioned one a couple slides back, the goblet cells that can be found in simple columnar epithelia. And there are two types of epithelial glands. The first type are endocrine glands. With endocrine glands, the secretions are released into interstitial fluid. So think of the endo as meaning inside, and the secretions are released into the body directly into fluid, not into a cavity or a surface. The secretion of endocrine glands are called hormones, and these are also called ductless glands. Then there are exocrine glands, where the secretions are released into ducts that open onto an epithelial surface. So exo means outside. Now that doesn't mean that all of these glands release their contents to the outside of the body, but they do all release them into like cavities or openings either outside or inside the body. So keep in mind that exocrine glands release their substances onto epithelial surfaces. So anywhere you have an epithelial surface, you could have an exocrine gland. Examples of exocrine gland secretions are mucus, milk, sweat, and oil. So sweat and oil are good examples of secretions that are secreted onto the surface of your skin. Mucus is a good example of a secretion that is secreted onto a surface, the lining of your intestinal tract, but that's not actually on the outside of the body. Glandular epithelia can be unicellular or multicellular, and this chapter does go into detail on how you can classify different exocrine glands, and we are not going to go into that level of detail, so I just want you to know the difference between endocrine glands and exocrine glands. And then here is a summary of epithelial tissue. All right, so remember, epithelial tissue is going to be found in areas that need linings. So linings of surfaces, linings of cavities, inside of organs, outside of organs, etc. Epithelial tissue can be divided into the squamous shape, and you have simple and stratified squamous. Simple is one layer, stratified is multiple layers. Cuboidal epithelial tissues are in a cube or square shape. You have simple, which is one layer, stratified, which is multiple layers, but this is very rare. And then you have that transitional epithelium, which looks cuboidal when it's relaxed, but looks squamous when it's stretched. Then you have the column-shaped epithelial tissue. Simple is a single layer of column-shaped cells. Pseudostratified is actually a single layer, but it looks like multiple layers. And then stratified, again, stratified columnar is rare, and this would truly be multiple layers. Epithelial tissues also include glandular cells, and these include your endocrine cells and your exocrine cells. Endocrine cells secrete their secretions into the interstitial fluids. Exocrine cells secrete their secretions onto an epithelial surface. And just a rule of thumb when you're trying to remember functions for the different tissues, again, this is a rule of thumb, so there are some exceptions, but when you're looking at a simple tissue, which has a single layer, think in terms of this type of tissue can allow permeability because stuff only has to cross a single layer of cells. It can also be very good at absorption and secretion, and where you see stratified tissue, you can think about protection because you have multiple layers of cells in these areas. In this section, we're going to introduce connective tissues and look at their functions. And this is an image of adipose tissue. So connective tissues actually vary widely in appearance and function. But all types share three basic components. They all have specialized cells. They all have extracellular protein fibers, and they all have some type of fluid, which is called a ground substance. The matrix is the term for the fibers plus the ground substance, so the stuff that is not cells. So the matrix is the combination of the extracellular fibers and the ground substance, and in connective tissues, the matrix usually forms the largest volume. So when we looked at epithelial tissues, we were all about the cells. And with connective tissue, while there are cells, we're paying a lot more attention to what is between the cells, so the fibers and the ground substance. So keep in mind that connective tissue is composed of the matrix plus the cells. And the matrix is going to be those extracellular fibers plus the ground substance, which is the fluid component. Connective tissue is never exposed to the outside environment. So you can find it underneath epithelial linings, but the connective tissue itself should never be exposed or open to either the outside environment or to like the lumen of your digestive tract or any of the openings inside your body. So connective tissue has a wide variety of functions, and it kind of depends on the specific tissue. So we'll go through the different tissue types and talk about their individual functions, but broadly, you can say that connective tissue helps provide structural framework for the body. So it does include things like cartilage, bone, ligaments, tendons. It also helps to transport fluids and dissolve materials. So believe it or not, your blood is a connective tissue. It also allows for the protection of delicate organs. So you can find connective tissue underneath the epithelial lining of membranes, and you can also find adipose tissue, which is a connective tissue surrounding a lot of the more sensitive organs. And then you can find connective tissue supporting, surrounding, and interconnecting other types of tissues. So think of it like the packing material that you put into a box to fill the empty spaces. It can also store energy reserves, and another example of this would be adipose tissue or your fat tissue. And it can play a role in defending the body. So again, your blood, which contains a lot of your white blood cells, is a connective tissue. So we're going to look at the three broad categories of connective tissues before we talk about each one individually. Again, remember that connective tissue is composed of the matrix plus the cells. And the matrix has the extracellular fibers and the fluid substance called the ground substance. So the first broad category is connective tissue proper. In this type of connective tissue, you will find many different types of cells and many different types of fibers. The ground substance is viscous or syrupy, and this type of tissue is subdivided into loose and dense tissues. The next broad category are your fluid connective tissues. In this type of tissue, you have very distinct cell types, but very few fibers. So you shouldn't find any fibers in your blood, for example, unless it's clotting. The ground substance is very watery. Again, think about blood and lymph. Those are your two fluid connective tissues. And then you have supporting connective tissues. In these types, you'll have a less diverse cell population, so typically only one type of cell, and you have lots of fibers. However, there is very little ground substance, so very little fluid, making these tissues much, much firmer, and your supporting connective tissues include cartilage and bone. And now we'll talk about each of these in more detail. Next, we are going to look at connective tissue proper. And this is made up of two broad types, loose connective tissue and dense connective tissue. And this is an image on this slide of reticular tissue, which is a type of loose connective tissue. So connective tissue proper is composed of many different cell types. First, there are the fibroblasts and fibrocytes. These are the most abundant. Fibroblasts secrete the fibers that you find in connective tissue, and we'll see what these fibers are on the next slide. And fibrocytes maintain the fibers. So fibroblasts secrete them, fibrocytes maintain them. And of these two, fibroblasts are always present in connective tissue proper. You can also find macrophages, microphages, and lymphocytes in connective tissue proper. Macrophages and microphages are both types of white blood cells. They are phagocytes, which means that they use phagocytosis to engulf bacteria and other foreign matter. And then lymphocytes are cells of the immune system, and you'll get a lot more detail with them in Biology 2252. You can also find mast cells, which is shown in this image in the upper right corner. It's got the little dots all over it. You can often find mast cells with granules that are full of histamines and heparin. Both of these compounds help with the process of inflammation. Like if you've ever taken an antihistamine, you're trying to block the secretion of your mast cells. So both the histamine and heparin help encourage inflammation in damaged tissue. You can also find adipocytes, which are shown as the yellow globs in this image. Adipocytes are fat cells, so adipo is the root word for fat, cyte is the root word for cell. You can also find melanocytes, which is shown by the darker brown cell in the upper left corner. These can produce a pigment called melanin, which actually gives our skin its color. But you can also find melanocytes not only underneath the epithelial layer of the skin, but also in places like the iris of your eye. And then you have mesenchymal cells. These are the stem cells of the connective tissue proper. So for example, if you need more fibroblasts or you need more macrophages, the mesenchymal cells can differentiate and change into these other cell types as needed. So those were the cells that you can find in connective tissue proper. Now let's look at the three types of fibers. And remember, fibroblasts are the ones that are making these fibers. So collagen fibers are long, straight, unbranched fibers. They are the most common type of fiber that you'll find in connective tissue proper. And they are flexible, so they allow for bending and flexibility, but they are also very strong. If you pull on both ends of a collagen fiber, it actually has more strength than steel. And if you look at the structure of a collagen fiber, you can see why. So the collagen protein itself is wrapped around itself, and then all of those wrap strands are then packaged into a bundle, and then your overall collagen fiber is multiples of these bundles. So it has a very strong, resilient structure. Reticular fibers are also composed of collagen. So in that regard, they're very similar to collagen fibers, but they have a different arrangement. So instead of being straight and unbranched, these can branch. So imagine the picture up here, but then you can have branches coming off of it. And the reticular fibers are thinner, so they don't have as many bundles within them. So the reticular fibers will form a network called a stroma, which is like a branching network of fibers. And around these fibers, you can put the functional cells of organs, and the fibers stabilize them. And parenchyma is a term that we use to describe the functional cells of organs. And the third type are elastic fibers. These are branched and they're very wavy, and they are composed of elastin. So that makes them different than the other two, which are made of collagen. And with the elastin protein, you've got little cross links between your different protein molecules, and that allows elastic fibers to stretch and then be able to relax and return to their original length. So as the name suggests, they are elastic. All right, so connective tissue proper can be divided into two major types: loose connective tissue and dense connective tissue. Loose connective tissue can be thought of as the packing material of the body. That means it helps to fill spaces, it cushions other areas of the body, it stabilizes organs, and it supports the epithelia. Dense connective tissue has a lot more fiber to it, so the majority of the volume of this tissue is composed of fibers, and particularly collagen fibers. So think of loose connective tissue as having a higher cell to fiber ratio, meaning you'll see more cells as compared to the number of fibers that you'll see. And dense connective tissue, you have a higher fiber to cell ratio, so you will see more fibers than you see cells, and that's what makes it dense. There are three subtypes of loose connective tissues: areolar, adipose, and reticular. And there are two main subtypes of dense connective tissues: dense regular and dense irregular. And then dense regular has a subtype called elastic tissue. So we'll go through and look at all of these one by one. So we will start with the loose connective tissues. The first one of these is areolar tissue. So just like with the epithelial tissues, you will need to know locations and functions for all of these. So areolar tissue is located within and deep to the dermis of the skin. It's also covered by epithelial linings of the digestive, respiratory, and urinary tracts. You can find it between muscles, around joints and blood vessels, and nerves. And it functions to cushion organs, to provide support while permitting independent movement. And then the phagocytic cells that you find in it, like the macrophages and microphages, help protect against pathogens. Areolar tissue is the least specialized of all of the loose connective tissues. It can contain all of those cell types we mentioned earlier and all three fiber types. So you can find collagen fibers, reticular fibers, and elastic fibers in areolar tissue. It also contains a very extensive blood supply, and as a result, you will frequently find areolar tissue underneath most epithelial tissue. So when we talked about the epithelial tissue, I kept reminding you that underneath it would be connective tissue, and specifically it's areolar tissue that you find underneath epithelial tissue. And the areolar tissue is providing the blood supply and nutrients to those epithelial cells, which, if you remember, are avascular, meaning they do not have blood vessels. Adipose tissue is the second type. Adipose tissue is located deep to the skin in a layer called the hypodermis, especially at your sides, buttocks, and breast. It also is found as padding around eyes and kidneys. Adipose tissue functions to provide padding and cushion shocks. It also provides insulation by reducing heat loss, and it stores energy in the form of fat. There are technically two types of adipose tissue. There is what is called white fat that has a pale yellow-white color. This is the typical type of fat, like you see this in your textbook illustrations, usually shown as a yellow area in the images. And when you, if you've ever watched a surgery and you cut into certain areas of the body, the fat does actually have a yellow-white color. The other type of fat is brown fat. It is highly vascularized with blood vessels, and that is what makes it look brown instead of white. We do know that infants have a lot of brown fat, and the function of brown fat is to release heat through a process called thermogenesis. So the brown fat burns up calories to release heat. Now, it used to be thought that adults had no brown fat, but new research is showing that adults do still have some small amount of brown fat in their bodies, and there is a lot of research undergoing of how we can activate this brown fat to help the obesity epidemic. The third type of loose connective tissue is reticular tissue. This can be found in a lot of organs like the liver, kidney, spleen, lymph nodes, and bone marrow. And its function is to provide a supporting framework. So we find reticular tissue in organs where we need the cells to basically have a frame on which to stabilize the functional cells. So there's two terms that are associated with reticular tissue. We say that the reticular tissue fibers form a stroma to help support the parenchyma. So the stroma are the fibers themselves, and I put two different colored slides here. These are still both reticular tissue, and the stroma are the fibers themselves. So the light pink in the left picture, the blue in the right picture, and up here in the textbook picture on the right, the fibers would be the brown portion. So that would be the stroma. The parenchyma are the cells that are supported. So the cells in between the fibers, dark purple in this view, red in the right, and then up here in the picture from the textbook, they're like a pinkish colored cell. All right, so now let's look at dense connective tissue. First, there is dense regular connective tissue. This is located between skeletal muscles and the skeleton. So between a muscle and a bone, we call those tendons and aponeuroses. You can also find them between one bone and another bone, or between a bone and an organ. We call those ligaments. You can also find this covering skeletal muscles and in your deep fascia. Dense regular tissue functions to provide firm attachment, to conduct the pull of muscles. It also reduces friction between muscles and stabilizes the relative position of bones. And for all of these, kind of think about what tendons and ligaments do, and that will help you remember what the functions are. Here is another image of dense regular tissue. So remember I mentioned earlier that with loose connective tissue, you see a lot of cells compared to the amount of fibers you see. And with dense tissue, you see a lot of fibers compared to the amount of cells. So with dense regular connective tissue, you will see a lot of collagen fibers that are all running parallel to each other. and you may only see a few fibroblasts scattered between them, and the dark purple spots are actually the fibroblast nuclei. Remember, fibroblast is the one cell type that is found in all connective tissue proper. So in this type of tissue, the collagen fibers run parallel to each other, and that makes it very strong. Remember that if you pull a collagen fiber, pull on one end and pull on the other end, it actually has a strength greater than that of steel. And some terms to remember: tendons attach skeletal muscles to bone, ligaments connect one bone to another, and an aponeurosis is a tendinous sheet that attaches a broad, flat muscle to another muscle or to several bones. And so think about the abdominal muscles. When you look at images of muscles in textbooks, you usually see this white area that represents the tendons, and if it's a very broad tendon that stretches over a wide area, then that is called an aponeurosis. Elastic tissue is a type of dense regular connective tissue, but instead of being dominated by collagen, it's dominated by elastic fibers. So essentially the elastic fibers have replaced the collagen, but they still all run parallel to each other. You can find elastic tissue between vertebrae of the spinal column, particularly the ligamentum flavum and the ligamentum nuchae. You can also find it in ligaments supporting the penis, ligaments supporting transitional epithelium, and in the walls of blood vessels. So elastic tissue helps to stabilize the position of your vertebrae and penis. It also cushions against shocks and permits expansion and contraction of organs. And here is an example of one of those ligaments that is made up of elastic tissue. It's called the ligamentum nuchae, and it's in the cervical region of your spinal cord. So you can think of elastic tissue as making these elastic ligaments, which are ligaments that have more flexibility than a typical ligament. And the last type of dense connective tissue is dense irregular connective tissue. You can find this in the capsules of your visceral organs, in the periostea and perichondria, in the sheaths or coverings of your nerves and muscles, and in your dermis, which is a layer of skin that underlies your epidermis. It functions to provide strength to resist forces applied from many directions, and it helps prevent overexpansion of organs such as the urinary bladder. So in the dense irregular connective tissue, we still have collagen and collagen fibers, but the fibers are not parallel. In fact, they run in sort of a mishmash pattern all over the cell, all over the place. So we say that they form a meshwork with no consistent pattern. You also might see the occasional fibroblast in there, but basically you see these fibers running in a bunch of different directions. This allows the tissue to withstand stresses from many directions. So think about the dermis of your skin, right? You can stretch your skin and move it around and push it in one direction and another direction, and you don't have to worry about tearing it open. So some terminology here. A capsule is going to be the thick fibrous layer around organs. So like there is a capsule, for example, around the kidney. The perichondrium is the sheath or a covering that you will find around cartilages, and the periosteum is the sheath or covering that you would find around bones. This section will cover the fluid connective tissues, and this is a slide of what blood looks like. Most of these little dots are red blood cells, and then the ones with bright purple stained nuclei are going to be your white blood cells. So there are two types of fluid connective tissues. The first one is called blood, and with blood you have a very watery matrix, which is called plasma, and you have a lot of cells, and you have very few, if any, fibers. Like the only times you should have fibers in blood is when the blood is clotting. The cells that you find in blood are called formed elements, and these are composed of red blood cells, which are also called erythrocytes. Erythro is a prefix that means red. You have white blood cells, like in this image here, we see neutrophils and monocytes, which are two types of white blood cells. So just a little note, the reason why we can see white blood cells in these slide images of blood is because their nuclei are able to be stained with dye, whereas red blood cells don't have a nucleus, and so that's why they just look like these little red circles, because they're pretty much just packets of hemoglobin. If you remember from chapter 3, red blood cells lose their nucleus and almost all of the rest of their organelles. You can also find platelets in blood, and platelets are just little pieces of cells, and you'll learn more about all of these formed elements next semester. So as far as the location of blood, it's normally confined to the cardiovascular system, so you will find it within the vessels that make up the system. And some terminology to go ahead and introduce you to, and you'll get more detail next semester. Arteries carry blood away from the heart, so away from the heart to the body tissues. Capillaries are the smallest vessels, and this is where you have the site of exchange of nutrients, gases, and waste between the blood and the tissues. And then veins carry blood back toward the heart. Blood functions to transport cells, specifically the formed elements, and also dissolved materials like nutrients, gases like oxygen and carbon dioxide, and waste products. The other type of fluid connective tissue is lymph. Lymph is formed when interstitial fluid enters the lymphatic vessels. So it's like a cycle. So we have a blood vessel here at top. Your blood vessel has the formed elements in it. You've got water and plasma in your blood. You've got dissolved substances like gases and nutrients. And at the capillary level, this fluid leaves the blood vessel, not all of it, but some of the fluid leaves the blood vessel and goes into the interstitial fluid. So this is the fluid in your tissues. So interstitial means tissue. So this is the fluid in your tissues. And then that fluid will be picked back up by lymphatic vessels. And once that fluid enters a lymphatic vessel, that is when we call it lymph. So lymph has very similar characteristics as blood, except it has far fewer red blood cells. The fluid is ultimately returned to the bloodstream. So it came from the bloodstream and it's ultimately going to go back to the bloodstream. So it's like a little detour for some of the fluid component of your blood. And the lymphatic system is monitored by the immune system. So a lot of the lymphatic organs and tissues, their responsibility is to monitor the lymph to make sure there's no pathogens or unwanted invaders in the lymph. So this is one way for the body to monitor the blood composition. So lymph functions to circulate nutrients, waste, or toxins, and I put equalized levels in parentheses because the lymphatic system helps keep things from building up in one location. So for example, if you've got a local area that's infected or got toxins in it, the lymph system helps to spread that out evenly, get it back to the bloodstream, get it through the immune system. Lymph also helps to maintain blood volume. And as I just mentioned, it allows immune surveillance, so it allows the immune system to look over this material that ultimately came from the blood, went through the tissues, and to make sure there's nothing dangerous in it. In this section, we're going to look at supporting connective tissue, and this is an image of elastic cartilage. So supporting connective tissue is made up of cartilage and bone. Cartilage has a matrix which is composed of a firm gel that contains chondroitin sulfate complexes with proteins. And of course, there are also going to be fibers there. And in cartilage, you can find all three fiber types: collagen fibers, reticular fibers, and elastic fibers, depending on what type of cartilage it is. Chondrocyte is the only cell type that is present, and they come from cells called chondroblasts. So during development, when the cartilage is being formed, a chondroblast is a cell that makes cartilage, and then after the cartilage is made, that chondroblast becomes a chondrocyte. Remember, chondro is the prefix for cartilage. And the chondrocytes live in these little chambers called lacunae, is plural, and lacuna would be singular. So here is an actual image from some cartilage tissue, and you can see the chondrocytes in brown, and then the white space around them are those lacunae that they are sitting in. That is a characteristic feature when you're looking at histology slides. To know you are looking at cartilage is to see the lacuna. Cartilage is avascular, like epithelial tissue. That means that it has no blood vessels, so the chondrocytes are only able to get nutrients by diffusion. And usually in your joints, you've got synovial fluid, which helps with the diffusion of nutrients and gases to and from the chondrocytes. So a term we've already mentioned on a previous slide, the perichondrium is the fibrous layer that surrounds pieces of cartilage. And the perichondrium itself is made of the dense, irregular connective tissue, but we're mentioning it here because you can find it outside or lining the different pieces of cartilage in the body. Cartilage does not heal very well, primarily because it is avascular, so it's unable to get a steady, reliable source of nutrients and gases since it doesn't have blood vessels. So this is why, for example, if you tear the cartilage in your knee, you're probably eventually going to have to get a knee replacement because the cartilage itself does not repair very well. And there are 3 different types of cartilages, and you do have to differentiate between them, and we're going to go over those next. So the first type of cartilage is hyaline cartilage. Hyaline cartilage is found between the tips of ribs and the bones of your sternum, which is your breastbone. It's also on the covering of bone surfaces at synovial joints. So in this image is a picture of the shoulder joint. So hyaline cartilage would be the cartilage that lines the ends of the bones at that joint. It can also be found supporting the larynx, which is the voice box, the trachea and bronchi of the respiratory system. And it forms that cartilage part of your nose. So the nasal septum that divides your left and right nostril is made up of hyaline cartilage. So hyaline cartilage provides stiff but flexible support, and it also reduces friction between bony surfaces. This is the most common type of cartilage, so you have more hyaline cartilage in your body than the other 2 types. It is very tough but flexible, so it has a lot of collagen fibers, but the collagen fibers are so densely packed that when you look at this type of cartilage under a microscope, you can't actually see the fibers. So in the lab, when you look at this tissue, it will look very smooth between the lacunae. And again, remember, cartilage is characterized by these chondrocytes, which are the little cells that are in these little bubbles called lacunae. And so if you see this smooth area between the lacunae and you don't actually see fibers, then it should be hyaline cartilage. The next type of cartilage is elastic cartilage. You can find this in the auricle of your external ear, or basically the cartilage part of your ear flap. It's also in your epiglottis, your auditory canal, your cuneiform cartilages of your larynx, so your voice box. Elastic cartilage provides support but tolerates distortion without damage and returns to the original shape. So again, think about your ear flap. Think about how you can move it. You can twist it. You can bend it back and forth, but it goes back to its original shape. Again, if we're looking at a picture of cartilage, we can recognize that this is cartilage because we see the chondrocytes inside these little bubbles called lacunae. Elastic cartilage is extremely resilient and flexible, and this is because it has those elastic fibers which can be stretched and then will recoil back to their original shape. And in the slide, you'll be able to actually see the elastic fibers running between the areas of the lacunae. So the elastic fibers are visible between the lacunae on the stained slides. And the last type of cartilage is fibrocartilage. You can find this in the pads within your knee joint called the menisci. It's also between the 2 pubic bones of your pelvis, and it's in your intervertebral discs, so those thick pads of cartilage that sit between each vertebrae. Fibrocartilage functions to resist compression, to prevent bone-to-bone contact, and it also helps to limit movement. So fibrocartilage has the least amount of ground substance of any of the 3 types of cartilage. So there's very little ground substance. That means it's much more dense and firm. than the other two cartilage types. And the matrix is densely interwoven collagen fibers. So on a slide, you can see the collagen fibers, and again, they run parallel to each other in these areas outside the lacunae. And also the lacunae of fibrocartilage doesn't have as much white space around the cells. So the cells are still in these little pockets, but you don't typically see as much white space as you do with the other two cartilage types. Fibrocartilage is very durable and tough. And keep in mind that some of your joints can contain multiple cartilage types, for example, your knee. And we're going to talk about joints later on when we get to the skeletal system. But just to give you an example, this is a picture of your knee joint up here at the top. And hyaline cartilage, remember, actually lines the ends of the bones. So you have hyaline cartilage at the end of your femur, and you also can't really see it, but there's a thin layer of hyaline cartilage at the end of the tibia. And then in your knee joint, you've got these two thick pads, and they're called menisci. You might have heard of somebody that had a torn meniscus, especially if they played sports or are a runner. And the menisci, which are these thick pads shown in light pink in this picture, are made of fibrocartilage. So sometimes you can have a joint that has two different cartilage types. The other type of supporting connective tissue is bone. And the entirety of Chapter 6 is dedicated to bone and bone tissue. So we're just going to cover a few highlights here, and mainly we're going to be contrasting bone with cartilage. So with bone, the amount of ground substance is very, very small, so very little liquid in bone. 2/3 of the matrix of bone consists of a mixture of calcium salts, mostly calcium phosphate, and we call this calcified. So that's why we say that your bones are calcified, because they have this hard mixture of calcium salts. And then the other part of the matrix is composed of collagen fibers. So you basically have like this meshwork of collagen fibers with this calcium phosphate packed in between. And you can think of it as kind of working the same way that steel reinforced concrete works. So back in the day when they invented concrete, they found that it could be very crumbly, and if you hit it with any type of a force, like with a vehicle, it would very easily break. So they came up with this idea of steel reinforced concrete, and what they did was they would take pieces of steel, they would tie them together and make this very strong like cage structure, and then they would pour concrete around it. And the steel plus the concrete together had a much stronger form and could withstand a lot more stress than either one alone. And so bone is very similar to this, in that the steel is like the collagen fibers. So you have this network of these long parallel collagen fibers, and then poured around and mixed in with these fibers is where you have the mineralized matrix that is made up mostly of calcium phosphate. So just like chondrocytes are found in cartilage, osteocytes are found in bone. And osteocytes also live in these little pockets called lacunae, so that is a similarity between bone and cartilage. But the osteocytes actually need to communicate with each other, and again, we'll go into more detail when we get to the bone chapter, but they actually need to be able to share cytoplasm, like through gap junctions. And so you have these little channels that run from one lacunae to another, and they're called canaliculi. And so they connect osteocytes to each other. And then just like we had a perichondrium, which was a sheet around a piece of cartilage, you also have a wrapping for your bones, and it's called periosteum, and it's the fibrous sheath surrounding the bone, and it's also made of dense irregular connective tissue. And your bone is very dynamic. So kind of like with the cytoskeletal elements that we saw in Chapter 3, your bone actually does go through extensive remodeling throughout your life, where it's broken down and rebuilt again. It just doesn't happen as quickly as the cytoskeleton inside cells. And it doesn't like change shape. So your femur is always going to be in a femur shape, but the femur you have today in terms of the actual cells could be completely different cells than you had 7 years ago, because it's constantly being broken down and rebuilt. So here is an image of bone. And so bone is composed of these larger structures that look like concentric circles called osteons. And within the osteons, you can see these little dark squished bits between the layers. Those are actually your osteocytes that are sitting in very flat lacunae. And then you have the channels that run between one osteocyte and another, and it kind of looks like these fine little lines. Those are the canaliculi. And then in the center of each circular structure called an osteon, you have a central canal, which is where you find blood vessels, because unlike cartilage, which is avascular, bone has a very extensive blood supply. So a final little comparison of cartilage and bone. So cartilage, we have the chondrocytes are the names of the cells, and they're found in the little lacunae pockets. Bone, we have osteocytes in the little lacunae pockets. The ground substance in cartilage is chondroitin sulfate mixed with proteins and water, and it's a gel-like matrix. Whereas with bone, it's a very small volume of liquid, mainly surrounding these calcium salts like calcium phosphate. For the fibers in cartilage, you can find collagen, elastic, and reticular in different proportions, depending on whether you are looking at hyaline, elastic, or fibrocartilage. In bone, it's going to be always primarily collagen fibers. As far as vascularity, that means blood vessels. There are none in cartilage, and there is an extensive amount in bone. The covering in cartilage is the perichondrium. The covering in bone is the periosteum. Both of these are made of dense, irregular connective tissue. Cartilage has limited strength, but it can be very flexible. So it bends easy and is hard to break. So limited strength, but high flexibility. Bone is very, very strong, but not so flexible, right? It resists distortion. You're not going to bend your bones. In fact, you have to apply enough of a force to reach a breaking point, and then the bone's not going to bend, it's going to break. So cartilage, limited strength, high flexibility. Bone, very strong, limited flexibility. Cartilage has low oxygen demands, which is a good thing because it doesn't have a blood supply. Bone has high oxygen demands, which is met by its extensive blood supply. So the nutrients to get to cartilage have to actually diffuse through the matrix, and that is why cartilage doesn't heal so well. And with bones, you get nutrients, they come through the blood vessels, and then they diffuse through the cytoplasm and the interstitial fluid that you find in those little canals that are called canaliculi. Growth, we're not really going to talk about the two different types of growth, but cartilage has two different types, two different ways that it can grow, interstitial or appositional, and bone only grows by appositional. And then the repair capabilities, they are limited in cartilage tissue, again, because it doesn't have a blood supply, whereas bone can heal itself very well, and we'll talk a lot about that in Chapter 6. And this section will be a quick little summary of the different types of connective tissue. And this is a slide image of compact bone where you can see the nice osteon with its concentric rings, the little osteocytes in their lacunae, and the central canal with blood vessels in the middle. So, the different types of connective tissues. First, we divide them into connective tissue proper, fluid connective tissues, and supporting connective tissues. If we look at the connective tissue proper, we can divide these into loose connective tissues and dense connective tissues. Remember that the loose connective tissue proper has more cells and fewer fibers, and the dense form has more fibers and fewer cells. The loose can be divided into areolar, which is the least specialized. It's also the type you find underneath all of your epithelial layers. You also have adipose, your fat tissue, and reticular. Your dense connective tissues can be divided into regular and irregular. With regular, the fibers are all parallel to each other. In irregular, the fibers run every which way. And then there is a subtype of regular dense connective tissue called elastic tissue, in which the collagen fibers have been replaced with elastic fibers, but they're still running parallel to each other. All right, then we have the fluid connective tissues, in which we have very few to no fibers at all. We have a fair amount of cells, and we have a watery ground substance. And your fluid connective tissues are your blood and your lymph. And these two are very similar, except lymph has far fewer red blood cells. And then you have your supporting connective tissue, in which you're going to have less of a liquid component and a much higher fibrous component and specialized cells. So you've got your cartilage with your chondrocytes. And remember, this has the gel-like matrix, so it has like a gel-like consistency. And then it has all three fiber types depending on what subtype. There are three subtypes of cartilage: hyaline, elastic, and fibrocartilage. And then you've got your bone, which has very little ground substance, so it's much harder. And between these two, remember, bone is strong but not flexible, and cartilage is flexible with limited strength. Now that we've talked about epithelial tissue and connective tissue, we can talk about tissue membranes. And there are 4 different types of tissue membranes. So I mentioned before that epithelial tissue forms linings, and underneath epithelial tissue, you will always find connective tissue. So if we take the epithelium and the connective tissue that sits under it, and we take these two together, we have what is called a tissue membrane. The first type is a mucous membrane. These must be kept moist, and they are composed of a glandular epithelia. And what that means is that you have an epithelial tissue that has some of those exocrine glands stuck in them, and the exocrine glands are secreting things like the mucus, which actually makes these mucous membranes. And then underneath the glandular epithelia, you have areolar tissue. Remember, areolar tissue is usually always the type that sits underneath epithelial tissue. And with the mucous membranes, the areolar tissue gets a special name called the lamina propria. I'm not sure why they gave this one a special name just for the mucous membranes, but they did. So remember, we've also mentioned previously about like these little goblet cells are a special type of epithelial gland, exocrine gland, that can secrete mucus. And it's an exocrine gland because it's secreting its secretion onto an epithelial surface, as opposed to endocrine glands, which secrete their secretions into the interstitial tissues. So altogether, this makes up the mucous membrane, the epithelium with the glands and the mucus, plus the underlying areolar tissue, which in this case is called the lamina propria. You can find mucous membranes lining the passageways and chambers that open to the exterior. So think about the inside of your nose, think about the inside of your mouth, think about the inside of your vagina or the inside of your anus, right? Any passageway or chamber that opens to the exterior is going to have a mucous membrane. So you can find these in your digestive tract, your respiratory tract, your urinary tract, so it lines your urethra too, and also your reproductive tracts. The second type of tissue membrane is the serous membrane, and we've actually already talked about these in Chapter 1. So with the serous membrane, we have a thin layer of simple squamous called the mesothelium, and underneath that, again, we find areolar tissue. So we have the mesothelium and the areolar tissue, and the mesothelial cells can also secrete a fluid called a transudate that actually will line these membranes and help with their function of reducing friction. You already know the 3 serous membranes. We covered them in Chapter 1. They are the pleural membranes, which line the pleural cavities that have the lungs. You've got the peritoneal membranes, which line the peritoneal cavity, which is in your abdominopelvic cavity. And you've got the pericardium, or the pericardial membranes that line the pericardial cavity where your heart is. So the 3 membranes that we initially talked about back in Chapter 1, now you can put this information in your brain. Those are called serous membranes because they have a simple squamous layer of epithelial cells sitting on top of areolar tissue. Remember that these types of membranes have 2 layers. They have a visceral portion and a parietal portion. And this was all covered in chapter 1, but to remind you, the visceral portion lines the organ. So for example, in the pericardial cavity, you would find a visceral pericardium lining the heart, and the parietal portion lines the cavity. So again, if we looked at the pericardial cavity, we would find a parietal pericardium lining the cavity itself. The third type of membrane is called a cutaneous membrane. This is only found in one location, and that is your skin. This is composed of a stratified squamous epithelium. So here it is in our picture. Remember, when you're classifying a tissue, you're looking at the shape of the cells that are the farthest away from the basement membrane and they're closest to the open area. So this is multiple layers, and the cells at the top are flat and skinny, and that makes this a stratified squamous epithelium. And again, it sits on top of areolar tissue, but with the case of the cutaneous membrane, we have another layer. We have some dense irregular connective tissue underneath the areolar tissue. So all three of these, the epithelium, the areolar tissue, and the dense irregular connective tissue, make up the cutaneous membrane. And you may have heard the terms epidermis and dermis before when you were learning about skin. The epithelium part is your epidermis, and the areolar tissue plus the dense irregular connective tissue, this part down here, makes up your dermis. And one characteristic of a cutaneous membrane is it's very thick and it's very waterproof, and it helps keep moisture in your body, and so it keeps the inside parts of your body from drying out, but itself is very dry. And the last type of membrane is the synovial membrane. So you find these in joints. So we're going to talk about joints later in the semester, but the word synovial usually always applies to joints. So in a joint, if you looked at the lining of the joint cavity, you would see the synovial membrane that lines the inside of the cavity. It is made up of, and I put epithelium in quotes here because it is a lining of cells, right? And we know that cells that form a lining we call an epithelium. And then underneath it, just like we've seen everywhere else, we have areolar tissue. And so together that makes up the synovial membrane. And then it's also, in this case, covered by a thick fibrous capsule on the very outside. But the reason the epithelium is in quotes is because it's not really a true epithelium. It's what's called an atypical epithelium, because there's no basement membrane like we have in other epithelial tissues. There are gaps between the cells, which you don't have in other epithelial tissues. And the cells themselves are mainly macrophages and fibroblasts, which make them actually a little bit more like connective tissue than epithelial tissue. But we still call them epithelium in the sense of saying that all membranes are composed of an epithelium plus connective tissue. The last couple of sections are going to be relatively short because with muscle tissue and neural tissue, we're going to cover those in much more detail later in the semester. So in this particular chapter, we're just giving you an overview. So let's look at muscle tissue, and this is an image of cardiac muscle tissue. So I'm going to give you the overview first in this case. So there are three types of muscle tissues, skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, and smooth muscle. All of muscle tissues have in common is that they're specialized for contraction. And we're going to get in a whole lot of detail, probably more than you would like, in chapter 10. So again, this is just an introduction to these muscle tissues, and mainly with a focus on how to tell them apart. So skeletal muscle tissue, you have very long, cylindrical, striated multinucleate cells. In fact, these cells are so long, they are often called fibers, even though they are single cells with all of the properties that we learned about in chapter 3. In fact, some of these cells / fibers can be up to 30 centimeters long, which is about the length of a 12-inch ruler. You can find skeletal muscle tissues combined with connective tissues and neural tissues to make up the organ that we call skeletal muscles. So for example, like the biceps brachii in your arm is technically an organ, and it's made up of skeletal muscle tissue along with nerves, blood vessels, and other connective tissues. Skeletal muscle functions to move or stabilize the position of the skeleton, so it pulls on your bones to provide movement. It guards entrances and exits to the digestive, respiratory, and urinary tracts. So, for example, you have sphincters, like at the end of your urethra, which you urinate out of. There's a sphincter there that allows you to control and get rid of your urine when you want to. So, voluntary control over the entrance and exit. The entrance, for example, your digestive system, you've got a lot of muscles, like in your throat, for example. We talked about this in chapter 1, but your skeletal muscles also generate your body heat. So as muscles contract, they use ATP, and a byproduct is that it generates heat. And your skeletal muscle tissue protects your internal organs. So as I just mentioned, these are very long, large cells. In fact, they're typically called fibers because they are so large. So they're often referred to as a muscle fiber, even though they are single cells. One muscle cell / fiber can have many nuclei, so up to 100 per cell. And again, this is because the cell is so large, and it has to make proteins in a bunch of different areas of the cell. And if you remember the protein making process from chapter 3, where the mRNA is made inside the nucleus and then it comes out and goes to a ribosome, well, because the muscle cells are actually so large, the nuclei, you have to have more than one, and they have to be spread all over the place so that you can have protein production going on in different parts of the cell. Muscle cells cannot divide. Skeletal muscle cells cannot divide. However, there are some stem cells in your skeletal muscle organs called myosatellite cells that allow for partial repair of torn or damaged muscle tissue, but it is limited in how much can be repaired. With skeletal muscle tissue, you have actin and myosin. These are two proteins organized in repeating groups, and we're going to get a lot more detail in chapter 10. But for now, you can know that the actin and myosin proteins organized in repeating groups is what gives muscle cells or skeletal muscle cells this striped appearance. And these stripes are called striations. And you're going to see later on that this is due to the arrangement of how those actin and myosin proteins are arranged. And just a little flashback to chapter 3, the actin protein forms the thin filaments, also called microfilaments, and the myosin protein forms thick filaments. And so we find both of these in muscle cells, skeletal muscle cells. Actually, go back, we find both of these in all muscle cells. So skeletal muscle cells, cardiac muscle cells, and smooth muscle cells. Another name for skeletal muscle tissue is striated voluntary muscle. The striated part is because you see the stripes from the actin and myosin arrangement, and the voluntary part because you have voluntary control over this type of muscle. So for example, if you want to move your arm, you think about moving your arm, and your muscle will contract and move your arm. So you have voluntary control over most of your skeletal muscles. So cardiac muscle tissue, the cells in cardiac muscle tissue are short, they're branched, and they are striated, usually have a single nucleus, and we're going to talk about the intercalated discs in a second. You can find cardiac muscle tissue in the heart, and it functions to circulate blood and to maintain blood pressure. So cardiocytes are the names for the cardiac muscle cells, and they are much smaller than skeletal muscle cells, so we don't call them cardiac fibers, we just call them cardiocytes. And there is usually just one nucleus per each cell because they are much smaller, so they don't need to spread their protein production around a huge cell. You do see striations in cardiac muscle tissue. So again, you see these faint lines that run up and down throughout the tissue. Again, that is due to the actin and the myosin arrangement. So the arrangement of actin and myosin in cardiac muscle is the same as the way it's arranged in skeletal muscle. One thing that is very unique about cardiac muscle tissue, and this will help you with your tissue identification in lab, and that is that cardiac muscle tissue has intercalated discs. And you can see this in the pictures. In this picture, it's the little squiggly black line. But in the pictures of the tissue that you see on slides, you see the faint striations throughout the tissue. That's the very faint up and down lines. But then you see these darker lines, right? And you don't see as many of these, but you see these dark lines. Those are intercalated discs. And these are connections between one cardiac cell and another cardiac cell. So two cardiac cells are connected at the intercalated discs. And these are made up of desmosomes, which we covered earlier, and gap junctions. So it allows one cardiac cell to share ions and material with another one. And it's how all of your cardiac muscle cells communicate and are able to contract at the same time, which allows your heart to beat in a rhythmic pattern. Cardiac muscle tissue has very limited ability for repair. This is why heart attacks are so dangerous, because with a heart attack, blood flow gets cut off to part of the cardiac muscle tissue. And if that tissue dies, then you cannot repair it, and so you're left with a permanently damaged heart. Cardiac muscle tissue is also called striated involuntary muscle. Again, it's striated because it has the striations from the actin and myosin, and it's involuntary because you don't have conscious control over it. You can't think, okay, I'm going to stop beating my heart right now, right? So you can't have voluntary thought control over using this type of muscle. And the last type is smooth muscle tissue. The cells in this type of tissue are short, spindle-shaped, non-striated with a single nucleus. You can find smooth muscle in the walls of your blood vessels. It helps them dilate and constrict. You can also find smooth muscle in your digestive, respiratory, urinary, and reproductive organs. For example, smooth muscle is responsible for moving the food you eat through your digestive tract. Smooth muscle functions to move food, urine, and reproductive tract secretions. It also controls the diameter of the respiratory passageways and the diameter of your blood vessels. So smooth muscle is composed of these small spindle-shaped cells, which is one nucleus. And I notice students a lot of times have the trouble with the description spindle-shaped, so I'll put a little picture. When we talk about spindle-shaped, we're just talking about a cell that's like, it's kind of fat in the middle, and then it tapers off to a narrow end on each end. So that's what we mean when we say spindle-shaped. Smooth muscle tissue cells can divide, and so they can regenerate after injury. So of all of your muscle tissue, this one can repair itself most easily, and it can divide to replace any lost or damaged smooth muscle tissue. So smooth muscle tissue does have actin and myosin, but they are arranged differently than in cardiac and skeletal muscle. So with the smooth muscle, because of the different arrangement, we don't see the stripes or the striations. So no striations in smooth muscle tissue. And smooth muscle tissue is also called non-striated involuntary muscle. Non-striated because we don't see those little stripes, and involuntary because, again, you don't have control over this. When you eat, your food moves through your digestive system on its own. You don't have to stop and think, okay, time to move the food from the stomach to the small intestines, right? This is going to happen involuntarily. So a quick comparison of the three different types of muscle, and again, you're going to get a lot more detail in Chapter 10. But if we look at the number of nuclei, skeletal muscles have many nuclei per cell. Cardiac muscle cells only have one, or usually only one. Smooth muscle only has one. Does it have striations? And that is the visible stripes from actin and myosin. Remember, they all have actin and myosin, but only if they're arranged in a certain way do you see the stripes. And the striations are seen in skeletal muscle and cardiac muscle, but not smooth muscle. The neural control, so your ability to control this type of muscle consciously, skeletal muscle is voluntary. Cardiac muscle and smooth muscle are involuntary or controlled on an unconscious level. And then special features, skeletal muscle cannot divide. It does have limited repair with the myosatellite cells. Cardiac muscle cannot divide, very limited repair, but one of its defining features is it has those intercalated discs, which are very easy to visualize on slides. And smooth muscle can divide and regenerate after injury. And the last tissue type is neural tissue. And there's only one type of tissue here, and that is neural tissue. So at least you don't have to know multiple types. In this tissue, though, we are going to differentiate between two cell types. There are neurons, and then there are supporting cells called neuroglia. So an overview, again, there's basically just one type of neural tissue. And in that one type of neural tissue, we have neurons, which are the cells that are specialized for the conduction of electrical impulses. So basically like little bits of electric signal, just like you have in the wires and all of the electrical devices in your home. And what this means for the cells is that we actually see reversible changes in the membrane potential. We introduced you to the membrane potential in chapter 3, and that was one of the things that I said is going to come back later. And it really comes back when we get to the chapter on how your nervous system works. And so neurons are cells that are basically built and specialized to be able to carry these electrical signals. And then the neuroglia are cells that support the neurons. So they're the posse to the neurons. 98% of neural tissue is in the brain and the spinal cord, which is what we call the central nervous system. The remaining 2% makes up the peripheral nerves that's out in your body. And we're going to go into a whole lot more detail in chapter 12. That's where we really have lots of fun because you know my background is neuro. So we're just introducing you at this stage in chapter 4. So again, there's two basic cell types. You have the neurons, which are specialized for sending electrical signals. These are some of the longest cells in the body. You can have neurons 2 to 3 feet in length, so you can have some really long cells. Most neurons cannot divide, and they have a very limited ability for repair. The neurons in your peripheral nervous system, so for example, the nerves in your hand and your arm, can repair a little bit better than the neurons in your central nervous system, like your brain and spinal cord. So for now, we just want you to get familiar and know the 3 regions of a neuron. So you have dendrites, which are the little projections that come off of the cell body, right? So those are the dendrites. Then you have the cell body itself, and that's going to contain all of those organelles that you learned about in chapter 3. And then you have the axon, which is a longer extension off of the cell body that usually ends in its own small extensions. All right, so for now we're just focusing on the basics and learning the structure of a neuron. The other type of cell is neuroglia. These are the supporting cells. You typically have roughly about 10 neuroglia for every 1 neuron, and the neuroglia focus on making the environment suitable for the neurons to do their best work, right? So they are support cells. In the central nervous system, which is your brain and spinal cord, your neuroglia, you've got 4 types. You've got ependymal cells, astrocytes, oligodendrocytes, and microglia. We're going to talk about all of those in detail in chapter 12. And then in the peripheral nervous system, where you have your peripheral nerves, you've got satellite cells and Schwann cells. And again, we're going to talk more about those in later chapters. So a review of what to know about neural tissue. You should know that neural tissue is composed of 2 cell types, neurons and neuroglia. For the neuron, we want you to know these cells conduct electrical signals, and we want you to know the 3 parts. So the dendrites that stick off the cell body, this is where other neurons make contact. You have the cell body itself, where you find all of the different parts that you learned about in chapter 3. And then you've got the axon, which is a longer extension, and this is how the neuron conducts information to other cells. All right, and the other thing that you need to know for now is the function of the neuroglia. I said that they support the neurons, but to get more specific, they maintain the physical structure of the neural tissue. They also help with the repairing neural tissue after injury. They often cannot repair the neurons, but they can help to repair the surrounding tissue. They perform phagocytosis. They provide nutrients to neurons, and they regulate the composition of the interstitial fluid that surrounds the neurons. And this is important to allowing the neurons to function correctly. And that's all for now about what you need to know for neural tissue. And the last section is on injury and aging. And here is a picture of your intervertebral discs between your different vertebrae. Remember, they are made of fibrocartilage, and when cartilage breaks down, it does not repair very easily. So here are your normal discs, and then over time, this is what it looks like when you have your disc degenerate. So a little bit about injury. So our tissues undergo a lot throughout our lives: impacts, abrasions, distortion, chemical irritation, infection, extreme temperature. So there's many ways that you can injure a tissue. All of these are going to result in a process called inflammation. And with inflammation, the damaged cells release chemicals called prostaglandins. This results in an immune response. And you're going to get a lot more information about how the immune system works in next semester, chapter 22. So after tissue is damaged or injured, the body wants to regenerate it, but their different tissue types have different abilities to regenerate. So epithelial tissue and connective tissue, except for cartilage, and smooth muscle tissue all regenerates very well. So those types of tissues you can replace when they've been injured, except for the cartilage. Striated muscle tissue, so that is skeletal muscle tissue and cardiac muscle tissue and neural tissue, all regenerate poorly, if at all. So these are the tissues that you want to take care of: your heart, your skeletal muscles, your brain, your spinal cord, your peripheral nerves, because you're going to get very limited regeneration of those tissue types. This is an image from your textbook that summarizes inflammation. I'm not going to go into this level of detail in this chapter, so I'm not going to test you over this level of detail, but I just wanted to point out a couple of things that relate back to stuff we learned earlier in the chapter. For example, we talked about mast cells being one of those cell types that you can find in connective tissue proper. And mast cells are one of the initiators of inflammation. So we mentioned earlier that they release histamine and heparin. They can also release those prostaglandins. And so when your tissue is damaged, it's kind of the mast cells that initiate that process of inflammation. And then you have the whole process of inflammation. Again, I'm not going to go into this level of detail. You can read it in your textbook if you're interested. Basically, the area that is damaged becomes red, hot, swollen, and you have pain in that area. So inflammation leads to those visible signs. And then the other thing I want to point out is after the inflammation goes away and your tissue starts to be rebuilt, one of the things that can happen is that fibroblasts, remember fibroblasts are another type of cell that you find in connective tissue proper. They can move into a newly damaged area and they can lay down a lot of collagen fibers to basically stabilize the area as it's being repaired, and that is what we call scar tissue. And depending on the area of the body and how severe the injury was, the scar tissue can be remodeled and goes away, or you can actually be left with a scar. And the last little section is on aging tissue. So as you get old, the speed and effectiveness of those tissues that can repair themselves decreases. Your epithelial tissue gets thinner, so that means like your skin gets thinner, the lining of your digestive tract gets thinner, so this can cause multiple issues. Your connective tissue becomes more fragile, so this can cause things like easy bruising, so you could easily bruise when you bump into something. You get joint pain from the deteriorating cartilage in your joints. Your bones can become brittle. There's a condition called osteoporosis, which we'll discuss in chapter 6. And then cumulative damage to heart muscle and neuro tissue causes major health problems. Remember, these are two tissue types that cannot be replaced and repaired. So the longer you live, the more accumulated damage you're going to have to these, depending on what your lifestyle was, basically. And a lot of our major health problems that we have in the elderly population are due to these cumulative damage that people have gotten throughout their lifetime to their cardiac muscle tissue and their neural tissue. Also, cancer rates increase with age. We talked a lot about cancer in chapter 3. Cancer, remember, is your normal cells that grow out of control after they've had a certain number of mutations accumulate in the genes that control the cell cycle and cell growth. And so the longer you live, the more chance you have of accumulating those mutations and having cells turn cancerous. So basically, getting old sucks. And that is the end of chapter 4. So don't wait to study. This is a lot of material. Good news is you're covering all of these tissues in multiple labs. So you should get a lot of repetition in your lab course. And I'm going to post some of my lab study interactive online videos that I made for my lab course. I'm going to post those on your D2L to again help you practice and hear all this information again, and hopefully to help you study for both your lecture test and your lab practical.